The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. Let me turn this down. It's great to be with you here again. Beautiful morning out in Edmond, Oklahoma. We're still at the headquarters campus, broadcasting live all through this week. Last night we had our final graduation activity, the Imperial Academy graduation, to see the seniors. So many of them grew up around Edmond. Of course, I haven't lived here for a few years, but going through the slideshow last night, very emotional experience. My son was among them, so seeing all of these little baby photos and the years as they went by through the many pictures that we saw. My son, by the way, gave the student address, and here's just a brief excerpt from his speech last night in front of the student body and also all the families and special guests.
Everyone here understands that Imperial Academy education is a lot more practical than anything you can get in the world. Like some of the public schools out there, we do prepare kids for successful careers in the future. And to demonstrate that, I believe last year we had the highest ACT scores in the state. But that is not what sets us apart from other schools. What really sets us apart is that we have the missing dimension in knowledge. And that makes our school more practical than any other in the world.
So there's a little bit of a snippet from last night. In addition to that, the school principal, Wayne Turgeon, he gave an address, and there were some awards for some of the students, not just at the high school level, but in the elementary level as well. Of course, a highlight of the Imperial graduation always is the kindergarten graduation as well. So we got to see the little tykes as they made their way on stage with big smiles to receive their kindergarten diploma. After that, we had some exhibits on display in the John Amos Fieldhouse, together with lots of snacks and fellowship. So a wonderful evening, and that just kind of puts the cap on everything that we've experienced over the past week here at the headquarters campus in Edmond, Oklahoma. Just a couple of emails that have come in response to yesterday's show. It says, you've been reporting that God has been using the Trump presidency to expose the corruption of the left. I wonder if he's now setting them up for an epic defeat in November. Well, we'll certainly see here in just a few months' time. Another one here says, the illogical nature of the leftist media and the radical left truly cannot be understood unless the devil is factored in. It's like they're fulfilling what Hitler said, the magical interpretation of things based on the will. I wanted to read that one in particular because we'll be getting into the magical interpretation just a little bit later on in this segment. And really it ties in well, too, with what we have scheduled for today as far as the Bible study is concerned as well. To begin with, let me just give you a quote. I mentioned this yesterday. I didn't quote it, but I mentioned this quote from the second lesson of the Armstrong College Bible Correspondence course. As I said, the content in there, even though it was produced many, many years ago, it's right up to date with what we're seeing in the world today. There's a few facts and figures that might need to be updated in that lesson, and some, as we now know, some predictions from the World Health Organization. I noticed one in particular in our correspondence lesson that was a fair bit off. And we now know a lot more about the World Health Organization. I'll talk some about that here in just a second as well. But listen to this quote in particular. It says, remember also that modern man already lives in an environment of poisons. He inhales dangerously polluted air, drinks contaminated water, and eats pesticide-laden foods. The inevitable result is that the heart, lungs, and the entire body in general are weakened, thus lowering resistance to disease, which nearly always strikes the weakest first. The disease, it nearly always strikes the weakest first. This is what we need to be hearing about more. I brought this up again yesterday. We've been talking about it actually quite a lot in recent weeks. the most vulnerable, the sick and the infirmed, and in particular the elderly, the nursing homes. I saw one congresswoman yesterday. She comes from the state of New York, and she's calling for an investigation into the Cuomo administration. She's putting those 5,000 deaths in nursing homes in New York. She's putting that on Cuomo's head. He's the one that sent all those sick patients in there. I think I saw another commentator who said, what would happen if the governor of New York was a Republican? Do you think it would be covered differently? What if Governor DeSantis from Florida, what if he was the governor of New York right now, and he gave that directive on March 25th, sending all of those sick patients back into the nursing homes? Do you think the media would be fawning over him the way that they do with Andrew Cuomo? You know it would be so different. But that's just exactly what we've come to expect in this upside-down world, where truth is buried and lies, propaganda, fiction, that's out there on display every day. And we're supposed to just believe it. Will worship. Just believe it. This is from Jeremiah Jacques' piece at the Trumpet yesterday. China blocked the World Health Organization from warning the world of COVID-19 as it hoarded medical gear. So it blocked the truth from going out. China did. And then it was collecting all of this medical gear before nations were aware of just how serious this disease would be. Think about how scandalous this action, this behavior is. And do you hear about it? Do the media, do they focus on it? Does Rachel Maddow talk about it? She had a program last night. I mentioned that letter that Donald Trump, his administration, wrote to Dr. Tedros and the World Health Organization, saying that if there aren't some dramatic changes here in the next 30 days, this temporary halting of funds, it's going to be permanent. And so naturally, as if right on cue, all the shows come on, MSNBC, Rachel Maddow and the others. And all of these facts brought out in President Trump's letter, instead of saying what was China doing, how did they get away with this? They instead attack President Trump and his letter. They look for any and every inaccuracy that they can find in the letter. This is from Jeremiah Jacques' piece. It says, the Chinese Communist Party recognized the danger of the coronavirus even at this early phase of the outbreak, but rather than trying to warn the world of the need to take measures to contain it early, it took exactly the opposite approach. It didn't warn the world. It didn't help other nations to try to contain it. It concealed the truth. And then it hoarded all of this personal protective gear, equipment, PPE it's called. Jeremiah says it told the WHO in January that China would stop cooperating with the agency's coronavirus investigation if the organization declared a global health emergency. So here is China telling Dr. Tedros, you better not declare this an emergency. If you do, we stop working with you. The media, they want to focus on Donald Trump saying, we're going to stop funding you because you're so corrupt, because you're just a puppet of the Chinese communist regime. And somehow the media in the United States, they make Donald Trump out to be the bad guy. Here is China. Here is the communist state of China saying, if you declare this a national emergency, this goes back to January, if you declare this a national emergency, we're going to cut off contact with you. Jeremiah says here, meanwhile, as the CCP, that's the communist government, was pressuring the WHO to downplay the threat, it ordered Chinese embassies and other Chinese organizations in countries around the world to buy up as much medical equipment as possible abroad and to ship it to China. This is astounding. The corruption, the selfishness. Let's hoard all of this equipment. He continues to write here that they ceased normal business operations during January and February to literally pillage Australia, to take one example, for epidemic-related supplies, which they proudly put into massive containers and shipped back to China. So all the face masks and everything else, they brought it back to China. And then when it finally was a national emergency, then when it finally was a pandemic coming forward to the middle of March, well, lo and behold, here's China with all this gear that they're quite happy to sell to the rest of the world at inflated prices, of course. We've got to gouge the prices. Listen to Peter Navarro as he explained, I think this is back on May 10th, just a week or two ago. He's talking here about what China did during the early stages of the crisis. Clip 1.
We also know, Maria, from their own customs data that they vacuumed up virtually all of the world's personal protective equipment, including over 2 billion masks. And we also know that today what China is doing, sitting on that stockpile of what we call PPE, is they're selling it at profit-sharing prices to some, and to other countries, they're actually putting pressure on those countries to deny the virus came from China or to talk about Taiwan or do other things. So that's in it in a nutshell.
So that's Peter Navarro, just a week or two ago, telling you what China's up to. Vacuuming all of this personal protective equipment up from around the world. Billions and billions of pieces of equipment. And then raising the prices as it sells it back to nations in need of this gear. And who funds the World Health Organization, which is a puppet of the Chinese communist regime? Far and away, it's the United States of America, up until a few weeks ago when President Trump said that's enough. I played this clip for you yesterday where he's explaining how much we support, the United States supports the WHO with funding. Clip 2.
And I think they've done a very sad job in the last period of time. And again, the United States pays them $450 million a year. China pays them $38 million a year. And they're a puppet of China. They're China-centric, to put it nicer, but they're a puppet of China.
They pay less than 10% of what the United States has paid the WHO. And yet there is the WHO from day one to this point, doing China's bidding. Just a puppet of the Chinese communist regime. That letter, I just had to race through it at the end of the first segment yesterday. But President Trump, he goes right down the list and says, here's what you've done. You said back in January that this virus could not be transmitted between humans. That's what China was saying, and the WHO was out there. They were the platform through which China was telling the world, there's nothing to worry about here. Even as they were hoarding all of this PPE. President Trump wrote on January 21st, President Xi Jinping of China reportedly pressured you not to declare the coronavirus outbreak an emergency. He's addressing this to Dr. Tedros. You gave in to this pressure the next day and told the world that the coronavirus did not pose a public health emergency. Just over 1 week later, on January 30th, overwhelming evidence to the contrary forced you to reverse course. The president went on to talk about how that Dr. Tedros and his World Health Organization, they were out there praising China, praising the strict draconian measures China was putting in place in Wuhan, the travel restrictions. China's doing, we wrote about this in the March or April issue of the Trumpet, how that China's just doing a fantastic job locking down everything. This was the new standard. Dr. Tedros loved it, except when Donald Trump put travel restrictions on China coming into the United States. Now, that was racist. And the thing of it is, this is the same mindset that they have over at MSNBC and CNN. The President of the United States, he sends out this letter, and he's the problem, not China, not the WHO, not the fact that the United States is paying $450 million. $450 million a year. China dips in or pitches in $38 million. Later on in the letter that the president sent, it says, if the World Health Organization does not commit to major substantive improvements within the next 30 days, I will make my temporary freeze of United States funding to the World Health Organization permanent and reconsider our membership in the organization. I cannot allow American taxpayer dollars to continue to finance an organization that, in its present state, is so clearly not serving America's interests. It's not even serving the interests of other nations. It's serving the interests of China. And here is the United States president exposing them for their corruption. And you would think the major media would at least look at the behavior of China. This is where the virus started. This is where it all began. But you know the history there. You can't even call it the Wuhan flu. Because, well, that's racist. Listen to this report. This is from, I guess it was CBS last night. This reporter speaking up, putting the blame for the joblessness, the unemployment, blaming President Trump for this as well. Here's a reporter never letting a crisis go to waste. Clip 3.
Mr. President, why haven't you announced a plan to get 36 million unemployed Americans back to work? You're overseeing historic economic despair. What's the delay? Where's the plan?
I think we've announced a plan. We're opening up our country. Just a rude person you are. We're opening up our country. We're opening it up very fast. The plan is that each state is opening, and it's opening up very effectively. And when you see the numbers, I think even you will be impressed, which is pretty hard to impress you. Yeah, go ahead, please.
President Trump embarrassing the CBS reporter who says that he's overseeing historic economic despair. So you see the strategy here? They hyped this. They triggered the pandemonium. They're responsible for the scaremongering. They're the reason that Governor Cuomo's emptied out hospitals and sent sick patients back into nursing homes. Nursing homes are not hospitals. But they cleared out the hospitals in the United States. Well, I should specifically say New York. And in the UK, it's the same story. I'll have more on that tomorrow. Got to clear out the hospital beds so that we can save the healthcare system. That's really what the aim was from the beginning. Now, of course, it's changed. Now we have to keep everything locked down until the virus is completely stamped out. Never mind flattening the curve. We're long beyond that. We've got to lock it down. We've got to keep people from ever returning to their jobs. And then here's a CBS reporter saying, oh, you're overseeing historic economic despair. He's responsible. He's responsible for the virus. He's responsible for the lockdown. He's responsible for the joblessness. Truth fails. Truth fails. Here is the radical left seizing upon this opportunity to carry out its radical agenda. Look at what's happening in social media. Richard Palmer wrote about this last night. How that YouTube, Google, Facebook, all of them, they're cracking down hard on any and every message that would go contrary to Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, Neil Ferguson, They're pro-science so long as the scientist agrees with their radical left-wing agenda. If you're a scientist who questions it or says that there's an alternative solution or certainly something that should be considered, well, these days you'll just be deleted from YouTube. These are the people that talk about defending the First Amendment, free speech. And yet more and more of these different views are just simply disappearing. The New York Times, in its podcast, I forget the name, maybe it's called Rabbit Hole, but this is the New York Times, the newspaper of record. And they have, in this clip you're about to hear, they have this discussion with the CEO of YouTube, Susan, well, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but in any event, listen to the New York Times reporter. The CEO is trying to explain what they've been doing with respect to deleting videos that don't conform to what the narrative is supposed to be with respect to COVID-19 and how we're supposed to fight it. But the New York Times reporter is saying, look, you've had such good success with deleting videos that go contrary to what's the traditional or conventional wisdom here, then why don't you do this with other subjects? This is clip 4.
We have everyone at YouTube working throughout this crisis to make sure that they are following what's happening, making changes on the policy, making sure that we are taking down content, making sure that we're adjusting whatever changes we need to our algorithm. So,
and as she's going through her list of everything that YouTube is doing on the coronavirus, it really strikes me like how much work it takes to make sure that this algorithm that YouTube has built, that it's not leading people in a dangerous direction.
I mean, I could go on. We did a lot of different steps here to make sure we were doing everything possible.
Yeah, I mean, just personally, like I've been impressed by how hard it's been to find misinformation about the coronavirus on YouTube. And I guess I'm wondering, like, why isn't it always like this? Like, what is preventing YouTube from taking this approach all the time to every subject?
Preventing YouTube from taking this approach on every subject. In other words, why don't you just decide you're in a powerful position? You can decide what's misinformation or not. And then you had the CEO of YouTube saying, well, we don't want to just, delete everything. That's what the New York Times reporter wants. This is crazy. This is in the United States of America. Now, don't get me wrong. There's plenty of filth and garbage that just spews out on YouTube every day. Content that should be blotted out, that in the world tomorrow, it will be blotted out. But here's the United States of America. They pride themselves in free speech. Anybody should have a voice. Well, not someone that goes against this radical left-wing agenda. Even when it's been exposed, so much of it, all the modeling and such, it's been exposed as a fraud. Richard wrote in his Trumpet brief, he said European governments want censorship to go further. And we've written quite a bit about this before at the Trumpet, just how the European Union factors into this. And the fines that the steep fines that they're slapping on YouTube and Google and other tech giants, if they go against European standards. It says last Wednesday, France adopted a new law against online hate speech. It says if content is ranked as hate speech, Google, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook must remove them in 24 hours. So it sounds reasonable, right? Well, of course, we don't want hate speech on there. But what's their definition of hate speech? That's the thing. It says, and if a regulator board decides the company is not meeting the requirements, it could fine them up to 4% of annual global revenue. For Google, that figure would be $6.5 billion. And the police can enforce internet service providers to block a non-compliant site everywhere in France. So Google and them, they don't want to lose business in Europe. It's a pretty big customer. It says a lot of this law, this is Richard writing, a lot of this law is laudable, especially the part about child pornography. The trouble is, hate speech and terrorist propaganda are pretty flexible terms, and the government gets to make the decisions. So here again, you have the bureaucrats. You have the people that have been working in government for decades. We've heard a lot from them, haven't we, in the past few years? They know. They're not elected. The people didn't select them or choose them to be in the positions they're in. They've just been appointed, and some of them have just been embedded into government bureaucracy for decades. And they know what's proper speech and what isn't. And they know what's hate speech and what isn't. And they know what's terrorist propaganda and what isn't. Well, as I say, we've written a fair bit about this at thetrumpet.com. My father has talked, I forget when this article appeared. Richard referred to it in his brief. It says, Germany's ambitions for the internet should concern everyone, even those who don't have a computer. That's what my father wrote. It says, we must put this issue in the context of Bible prophecy and history. The German-led EU is behaving the way the Holy Roman Empire has always behaved. Germany is once again seeking to impose its will on the world. It says this is a difficult message to accept, and many people will disagree with it, but it is the truth. And Richard goes on to explain that the internet is changing right before our eyes. I'm amazed more and more, even in the UK, just how many websites that I go to for the news are blocked. And there's just some alert or message up there that says, according to EU standards, you can't get through to this one. That's happening more and more. That's in the United Kingdom. And maybe some of that will change as Brexit is finalized and all that. But still, these are some powerful gatekeepers controlling the information flow, deciding what is and what is not misinformation. That's very dangerous. No wonder so many people are duped. No wonder so many people are blind to the truth. And you think about the scriptures like 2 Corinthians 4, how that Satan blinds them to the truth of the gospel. There was an article in the Stack earlier this week about the age of magical realism. Seems real, seems like this is the truth, but really it's fantasy. It's fantasy, and I just want to refer you back to the May-June Trumpet. That was the coronavirus special. Coronapocalypse was on the cover. But in that article, my father that trumpet, my father had an article titled A Dangerous New Age of Worshiping the Will. And he refers to some of the phraseology that Adolf Hitler used. A new age of magic interpretation of the world is coming, an interpretation in terms of the will and not of intelligence. It's the will that really is important. Well, whether it's facts or truth, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. It's just accepting what Rachel Maddow says about the letter to China, or rather the WHO. My father quotes Hitler. Hitler said there is no such thing as truth, either in the moral or the scientific sense. There's no such thing as truth. Will worship, that's all that matters. My father said this is exactly what Hitler was talking about, will worship. Of course, you can look at Colossians 2, I think it's verses 18 and 23. Will worship, but on another level, magic interpretation in terms of the will. Hitler said this is how it works. This is how it works now. Your logic, facts, evidence, and truth won't stop us. We follow a magic interpretation today. And as it happens, Google and YouTube and them, Facebook, they're following right along with this magic interpretation as well. Will worship is impervious to the truth. That is the new age Hitler wanted to usher in. There is no absolute truth. Don't look to the Bible for answers. Just have a magic interpretation of things. The implication is just follow our will. Just follow our will. That's from my father's article in the May-June Trumpet. And then you look at this recent article. This, by the way, it comes from, I think it's a military news site called Grounded Curiosity. Not too familiar with that site, but the reason the article jumped out at us is because it uses even some of the same language that my father used in the recent Trumpet. This author, Todd Schmidt, he writes, American society has entered an era of magical realism with real-world consequences. It's an era tainted by decay, diminishment, and dilution of truth as it becomes intermingled with fiction, fantasy, and the farcical. It's an era stained by political polarization and proclamations of alternate facts and alternate realities. He says it's an era soiled by targeted, biased media that divides and parses society by beliefs and values, peddling and pushing biased opinions that masquerade as fact. Truth has become tarnished and individualized, while society abandons universal certainties. It says, left unchecked, this era of magical realism will have consequences for American society, security, and civil military relations. See, there are consequences for this level of ignorance. There are consequences. That's what he's saying here. We're living in this era of magical realism. He talks about the intermingling of truth and fantasy. There are no absolute truths. We've really stressed this in our Principles of Living class here at the college. Now, that's a class that goes back 19 years, at least with us. Herbert Armstrong was, of course, delving into some of that same instruction long before we came along, the PCG, I mean. But the point I want to bring to you is that just like these scriptures about Satan's influence, the level of deception, the fact that this present evil world is exactly that, it's evil through and through. So many of these things we've tried to emphasize with the students over the years. Wow, you look at the news coverage today, you look at what passes for truth today, and it is shocking. It is just shocking to see this intermingling of truth and fantasy. There's no regard for cause and effect. What caused the virus? Why are the sick and the elderly vulnerable? What about the immune system? How do you prevent disease? These are just basics. This is cause and effect. There's not nearly enough out there on these subjects. And in some cases, when there is something good, it's deleted. It's removed. We are not living in normal times. These days that we're in, they're very much abnormal. My father wrote in that May-June issue, Hitler believed that he did not need to rely on reason, intelligence, reality, absolute truth, or God. Instead, he worshiped his own will and believed he could create his own reality. Consciously or subconsciously, many people today believe the same thing. They just keep lying until they convince themselves and those around them that they are right. Here again, I'd refer you to Colossians 2, verses 18 and 23. And then also, you can look back at that article. We've already, I think, produced another Trumpet, the July issue. But if you go back to the May-June issue of the Trumpet magazine, the article title is A Dangerous New Age of Worshiping the Will. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily radio show. If you'd like to email the program, You can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. The Armstrong College Bible Correspondence Course is a distance learning program that makes the Bible clear and understandable. The correspondence course enables enrollees to learn what the Bible itself says about subjects that affect you and the world you live in. This fascinating Bible course highlights and proves what the Bible says about morality, war, religion, terrorism, and other current events, focusing on the root causes of this world's many problems facing man, as well as their solutions. The Bible and this course also focuses on the reason mankind was created in the first place, the way to happiness, accomplishment, and fulfillment, as well as the truth behind important doctrinal questions, such as what happens after we die, the nature of God, the resurrection, the millennium, and other critical subjects. Enroll today in the Herbert W. Armstrong Bible Correspondence Course. Email your request to td@kpcg.fm or visit thetrumpet.com. The Trumpet Daily.
In that article from the May-June Trumpet, my father said that when human beings reject God's truth, they start worshiping their own opinions. They start worshiping human reasoning. He says they start thinking like Satan. That's what Satan wants, ultimately. He wants us to think like he thinks. Satan doesn't come with all these facts and this truth, and he's trying to convince you of the truth. He wants you to worship his will. That's what he wants. And by that, it's basically worshiping human opinions, human reasoning, whether it's your own or someone else. Trusting in man, Jeremiah 17. Now, if you look at cause and effect, as I also mentioned there before the break, if you look at root causes of why this world, this society is the way that it is, you go back all the way to the Garden of Eden, as I discussed with you yesterday at the end of the show, and you look at the choices, you look at the decisions made by Adam and Eve, there in Genesis 2 and then Genesis 3, when they rejected God's revelation as the source of foundational knowledge. It's not all knowledge, but it's like the foundation for a structure, for a house. If you don't have the foundation, the structure is not going to hold. And so Adam and Eve, from the very beginning, they rejected God's revelation. They rejected the source of foundational knowledge. And this is, even as my son was discussing last night, this is the missing dimension in education today. God's truth, God's revelation, revelation from God. God intended for man to use the Bible as our guide, to use the Bible as the foundation of building up this knowledge, this structure of additional knowledge. It's got to be based on that essential knowledge from God. Otherwise, the whole structure is flawed. The whole structure, it's not going to be able to hold up. As soon as the first storm comes along. Isaiah 1 here in verse 4, it says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the eternal," it says. "They have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger. They are gone away backward." So we think we're progressing. In fact, we're going backward. In fact, we're getting worse. There's a sickness, a national sickness in the United States, in Great Britain. And it was prophesied prophesied long ago. Verse 5, it says, "Why should you be stricken anymore? You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint." So and it's at the top of every news program, still 2-3 months into it. Sickness, disease, a worldwide pandemic. And really the big story here is that it's exposed a spiritual sickness that is so much worse. It's exposed the sickness here in Isaiah 1, the sickness prophesied for our nations. Head to toe, it says. Verse 6, "From the sole of the foot, even unto the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment." So sickness, and it's not being treated. There's no healing. Isaiah says there's no soundness in the head. That means there's no sound thinking. There's no clear thinking. Lesson 2 of the correspondence course. Listen to this quote. This is from early on in the lesson, page 5. "One reason is the impact of science." He's talking here, or the lesson is about why so many people today are scoffing at the prophecies of God. And then this is the answer. "One reason is the impact of science, specifically the theory of evolution, on mainstream churches. Many calling themselves Christians have been educated at top secular universities that have replaced a belief in the Bible as the directly inspired Word of God with a belief in the infallibility of the scientific method, which relies heavily on faulty human reasoning. Will worship, just like I mentioned in the previous segment. This magical interpretation, faulty human reasoning, that's leading us to destruction and ruin, and so many other prophecies, of course, expound upon that. Verse 9 here, it says, "Except the Eternal of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we should have been like unto Gomorrah." So God's doing his work today through a very small remnant, and if not for that remnant, this is God's assessment of our society today, of our nations today. It's exactly like it was in the days of Sodom. I went home, sometimes I do this when I return home for breakfast right after this show. I'll turn on the morning news. It's and by news I mean the morning shows, NBC or just to see what they're covering. 90% of it is celebrity news, for one, and then the rest of it, it's just all flowing through this left-wing agenda. Every single bit of it. There is no truth in the land. You see why it's so important, God's work. This program, the Trumpet website, the Trumpet magazine, I've emphasized over and again the last few months how that every single issue of the Trumpet magazine, it's all of them, they're ahead of the curve. They're out front. They're leading the way. You get it in your mailbox, and then you look at, well, just to take the one example, my father's article in the May-June issue, Will Worship. How important is this educational program that you have in God's church, the college, the academy, all the instructions, all of the literature, all of the teaching, all of the broadcasting? Mr. Armstrong said in 1965, "The future welfare and even the existence of civilization is dependent on the educational system." There's no hope for this world because of its educational system, because it's sick from head to toe. It's sick, and the sickness is out on display. They had a couple of stories. I even forget what the subject was about. But anyway, when I'm watching about 10 minutes of this on NBC or CBS, they showed these families and how they're coping with the COVID-19 crisis. All of these families confined to their homes, and they put like just 6 or 7 thumbnail pictures of families, and they have to make sure that at least 1 or 2 of the thumbnails is a completely dysfunctional family, an upside-down family. Certainly not a traditional family. You can't put 6 or 7 traditional families up there. You've got to show the bizarre. You've got to display the bizarre and the upside down and the dysfunction. This is Sodom and Gomorrah, after all. We celebrate that. That's what you get when you turn on the news, quote unquote, for 5-10 minutes. It's right out of Isaiah 1. My father wrote in 2003, the education of this world is leading to catastrophe. We must have an education that brings peace and hope. That's the kind of education our AC students receive. So they come in just like I covered in that commencement. We played that for you on Monday's program, but they come into the college program and they learn right away that human nature is not good. It's not progressing. Human nature is actually Satan's nature. And so when we repent of going the way of the devil. We come out of this world. We plug into the mind of Christ. We think differently than they do in this world. True education, if we submit to God as our educator, it will ensure that we develop an energetic and healthy and logical and spiritually oriented, sound mind. You don't see that a lot in today's world. The soundness. There's no soundness. That's what Isaiah 1 says. There's no soundness in it. That's why we need the mind of Christ. Philippians 2:5. That's why we should be ever thankful for God's truth. You know, there is no book in the world today as current or up-to-date as the Holy Bible. Did you know this? Written thousands of years ago. And look at these scriptures. Applicable to what we're seeing now, right now. No soundness. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 6. This is Paul writing to his assistant, Timothy. He says, "Wherefore I put you in remembrance, that you stir up the gift of God, which is in you by the putting on of my hands." He's saying to Timothy, you stir up the Spirit of God. You stir up, the Spirit of God is his mind. It's the mind of Christ. It's God dwelling in you. And God in you is how we think straight, is how we promote truth. Verse 7 says, "For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." The Spirit of God is the spirit of soundness. It's the spirit of a sound, clear-thinking mind. God gives us that if we go to him in repentance and faith. He gives us a logical mind. He gives us a balanced mind. It allows for us to develop the whole man, as it says in Ecclesiastes 12. Back to Isaiah 1. We can finish going through this passage here. Isaiah 1, it talks about the sickness and how that we've gone the way of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then down in verse 16, this is Isaiah 1:16, it says, "Wash you, make you clean, put away the evil of your doings from before mine eyes. Cease to do evil." Stop with the evil. Clean up your life. Be purged of those sins. Turn to God in repentance and faith and be clean. Verse 17, it says, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow, serve in the work of God, in other words. Come out of this world in the way of selfishness and vanity and pride and start giving to the family of God and start serving in the family of God. My father writes in the Isaiah booklet how that the leaders, the Laodicean leaders, that's the lukewarm leaders of the seventh era of God's church, they led the church, God's church, away from Christ. And how that we have a responsibility, we in the PCG, to plead or to fight for the church. That's what we're doing with these broadcasts and with the program, The Key of David, with the literature. We're pleading with God's people. Turn you. Turn back to God. Turn back to the truth. Verse 18 in Isaiah 1, it says, come now and let us reason together, says the Eternal. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. Come and reason together with me, says God. Reason together with God. That's what true education is. It's reasoning with God. That's what the AC education is all about. That's what the IA education is all about. Reasoning together with God, talking to God, communing with God in our prayers, in our Bible study. This is the foundation. This is the essential knowledge. This is the missing dimension in knowledge. Mr. Armstrong wrote this, the very first need of the first man and the first woman was to be given essential knowledge. That is humanity's first need today. But humanity has rejected that essential knowledge. You see, this is their first need. This is why the world is in so much trouble right now, because mankind has rejected the most essential knowledge there is. We have rejected God as our educator. He's our creator. He's our maker. But we reject his authority. We reject his education. And so we are where we are today. This is the reason. Mr. Armstrong said, here enters a basic truth long ago forgotten by the world. The Almighty is not only the creator, he's also the great educator. This is a truth that's been forgotten, long forgotten by this world. Even the world of religion, even the world that would accept that God is creator, they reject the fact that he's educator. And we're here to educate this world, those that will listen, in this essential knowledge, the missing dimension in education. There's examples if you look in the New Testament. Acts 17, Paul there reasoning with the brethren out of the Scriptures. He was reasoning with God, Paul was, in coming into the truth, continuing his education, and then going out and teaching others. Teaching others. This is Acts 24 and verse 25. It says, and as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go your way, for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will call unto you. Felix didn't want to respond to the truth. Not then, not at that moment. He said, maybe I'll do it later. But this is an example, and there's many of them, of God's servant, the Apostle Paul, reasoning out of the Scriptures. That's God's perspective. That's how we understand the world today. This is how we understand world events. Come, let us reason together. That's Isaiah 1 in verse 18. It's a great memory verse. It's a great memory verse for the family, for your children as well. Reasoning together, that begins, of course, with our prayer and our Bible study, and then added to that fellowship, fasting, and so on. Getting to know God, that's the most important relationship there is, your relationship with God. And that is the essential key to building that foundation of God's truth, so that we can then go on and be truly educated. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email us, send comments to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for joining us on today's show, and we'll see you tomorrow.